The horizon of Ilara 7 bled with the color of the setting twin suns, casting long, twisted shadows across the barren, rocky wasteland. Ethan Sharp had never liked this planet. Its desolation reminded him of how small humanity was in the grand tapestry of the universe, a truth he often preferred to ignore. Still, his orders were clear. Remain on Ilara 7 as part of the peacekeeping mission, assist with terraforming efforts, and report any anomalous energy reading. It was a mission that had begun to feel like an endless, repetitive cycle. The atmosphere here was thin, and every breath felt like it took more effort than it should. There was no sign of life in the cracked, dusty landscape, save for the occasional human worker or drone. But that night, something changed. Ethan's boots crunched across the rocky terrain as he moved toward the source of an anomalous energy signal, a flare of unusual electromagnetic activity detected by one of the colony's satellites. His eyes narrowed as he observed the rocky expanse ahead, where the signal had originated. The air felt colder here, and the hairs on the back of his neck prickled. Something was out of place. The night had already begun to settle in, and the red and purple hues of twilight gave way to a darkness that felt deeper than it should. The dark sky stretched endlessly above him, dotted with a million stars, but there was an odd, unnatural silence. Not a breeze, not a sound. Even the wind, which normally howled across the barren plains, had abandoned this place. Ethan wasn't sure why, but a sense of dread tugged at him. He pressed on. After what felt like hours, he finally came upon the source of the anomaly, a large, smoldering wreckage. The remnants of a ship, blackened and twisted, sat half-buried in the rocky ground. Smoke still rose in faint wisps from the wreckage, the heat of it apparent even at a distance. It was a small ship, certainly not a human vessel. His fingers brushed the comm link at his neck, but before he could transmit a signal, a noise stopped him. A low, guttural groan came from somewhere within the wreckage. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He crouched, reaching for his sidearm. The noise came again, a tortured sound that echoed through the emptiness, faint but unmistakable. It was a sign of life. The medic inside him took over. His training had always emphasized saving lives, no matter the risk. He was not a soldier, not a fighter. He was a healer. He approached the wreckage, moving swiftly but carefully. The ground around him was littered with twisted metal shards, glowing faintly in the dim light of the two moons overhead. There was no immediate sign of danger, but that didn't mean there wasn't something worse lying in wait. "Hello?" he called, his voice cutting through the stillness. "Is someone there?" There was no response. He moved forward, stepping over debris and climbing carefully onto the wreckage. He squinted into the shadows, looking for any hint of movement. The groan came again, this time more clearly. It was followed by a weak cough. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. He couldn't just leave, not when someone was alive. He pulled open a section of the ship's hull, and the interior was darker still. The smell of burning metal filled his nostrils, but beneath it was something else, a sickly sweet scent, like something otherworldly. He hesitated for a moment before pressing on, deeper into the wreck. Then he saw her. A figure slumped against the wall of the ship, her skin shimmering faintly in the darkness like polished silver. Her hair, if it could be called hair, was like strands of liquid light woven together with what seemed like energy. Her face was pale, her breathing shallow, and her eyes were closed, but they flickered faintly with an ethereal glow. A quiet hum, almost imperceptible, radiated from her body. She was alien, no question about it, but Ethan couldn't leave her. His training kicked in as he rushed to her side, assessing her condition. Blood, or something that resembled it, was pooling on the floor beneath her, and her chest rose and fell with slow, labored breaths. There were injuries, deep gashes along her arms and side, burns covering parts of her exposed skin, but the most disturbing sign was the faint, steady pulse of energy emanating from her body, as if she were alive with a force that defied biology. This was no ordinary being. Ethan didn't hesitate. He could save her. He knew he could. He pulled out his medical kit, the tools within it designed for the most critical of injuries. He began working quickly, sealing the burns with a nanosuture, applying a gel that could temporarily stabilize her vitals. Despite the shock of what he was witnessing, Ethan's mind remained calm, focused on the task at hand. Every move was practiced, every tool employed with precision. His hands moved over her body, scanning for more injuries, but as he worked, he noticed something strange. Her skin seemed to pulse with each touch, as though responding to his presence, to the warmth of his fingers. It was unlike anything he had ever encountered. And then, as he reached for the final vial of stabilizing serum, her eyes fluttered open. They were the color of the stars themselves, deep, glowing blue, filled with an intelligence that surpassed anything he could comprehend. She stared at him, her gaze locking onto his, and for a brief, surreal moment, Ethan thought he could feel her thoughts, like a distant whisper in his mind. He recoiled, but there was no fear in her eyes, only a strange sadness. "What are you?" he whispered, almost to himself, though he knew she couldn't answer. Her lips parted, but the words she spoke were in a language he didn't recognize, a series of melodic syllables that echoed in the empty space between them. Her voice wasn't human. It was like nothing he had ever heard before, sweet, alien, and yet somehow familiar. He fumbled for his translator device, his heart racing. "Hold on, I can help you." With a strained effort, he activated the device and aimed it toward her, hoping it would catch her language. The device crackled to life, translating her speech into something more comprehensible. "Thank you," her voice echoed through the translator, a soft but urgent plea. "I need to leave this place. They will come for me." Ethan froze. "Who?" he asked. "Who's coming?" Her eyes darkened for a moment, her hand weakly lifting toward the sky as though trying to push away some unseen force. She grimaced, as though the act of speaking drained the last of her energy. "The Draxians," she whispered. "They are always coming." Before Ethan could ask more, the ground beneath them rumbled. The ship groaned in protest, and the sound of approaching engines, low and thunderous, cut through the stillness. A shadow loomed in the distance, its shape unmistakable, a Draxian warship, sleek and terrifying. His pulse quickened. The Draxians were notorious for their violent campaigns, and if they were already here— "They're coming," she repeated, her voice now panicked, weak. "You must run." Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as the shadow of the warship grew larger, its presence casting a dark pall over the desolate landscape. He couldn't let her die, not after all he had done to save her. And yet, the truth was undeniable. He was not equipped to fight an enemy like this. But then, she looked at him with those glowing eyes, and something shifted. A sudden, unexplainable connection filled the space between them, and Ethan felt his own heart begin to beat in sync with hers. Her next words weren't spoken aloud. They were felt, deep within his mind. "I can give you power to fight, but it will require something from you." Ethan's breath hitched as the Draxian warship descended, its engines flaring with the heat of an impending strike. He glanced down at her, unsure whether to trust her, but in that moment he understood. There was no choice. His hands shook as he pressed them to her side. She was burning with fever, her energy flickering weakly. "I'll do it," he said, though he didn't know what he was agreeing to. But he knew one thing for sure. He would not let her die. She smiled weakly, her lips parting again in that strange alien language. But this time there was a glow to her expression, a look of acceptance. "Then we are bound," she whispered. And with that, Ethan Sharp's world, his entire understanding of reality, changed forever. The harsh winds of Alara 7 howled, carrying with them the distinct metallic tang of the scorched atmosphere. Ethan stood still, his mind still reeling from the blast of power that had surged through him just moments before. The after effects of the energy still buzzed beneath his skin, like an electric hum that he couldn't shake, no matter how much he tried to focus. He felt Ilara's presence beside him, though her form was weaker now, her breathing shallow. The energy of their bond had momentarily stabilized her, but the toll it had taken on her was evident. Her once vibrant skin now seemed paler, almost translucent, and her eyes, those strange, glowing blue eyes, were no longer the radiant beacons they had been when he first found her. Instead, they were dimming with exhaustion. "We need to move," Ethan murmured, his voice tense, eyes scanning the horizon. The Draxan warship was still in orbit above them, its presence a constant reminder of the danger they were in. The wreckage of the ship's crash site lay all around them, a twisted, charred mess of metal, an eerie testament to the battle that had occurred not long ago. Ilara gave a faint nod, but her body seemed to tremble as she tried to sit up. Ethan dropped to his knees beside her, his thoughts a whirlwind of confusion and concern. "Hold on, Ilara," he urged, gently touching her shoulder. "I'm not leaving you here." Her gaze turned to him, a flicker of something ancient and wise behind her gaze. "You cannot save me with your strength alone," she whispered, her voice barely audible against the howling wind. "The Draxians are relentless, and there are other forces at play here that you don't understand." Ethan's heart pounded harder at her words, but his resolve only solidified. The last few minutes had felt like a dream. His blood now mingled with hers, and something had awakened inside him, something powerful and raw. But that power had come with a price, and he feared the cost of what they'd just done. "We don't have a lot of time," he said, pressing a hand against the wound on her side. It was still bleeding, though not as profusely as before. He'd used what little medical supplies he had, but the wound needed more than just a field dressing. It needed proper care. "You need to understand, Ethan." Ilara's voice was growing weaker. My people are ancient. I'm not just an alien. My race, the Krelthi, have existed for millennia. We were the architects of a galaxy-spanning empire, long before the Draxians rose to power. But we were betrayed, trapped. Ethan leaned in closer, feeling the weight of her words pressing down on him. Betrayed by who? And what does this have to do with me? Her eyes flickered, their glow dimming for a moment as if struggling to focus. "You are connected to me now in ways you don't understand," she said, her voice rasping with strain. "The blood bond we share. It's ancient, something that hasn't occurred in centuries. I can feel your life force, Ethan, and you can feel mine." Ethan was about to ask more, but the words caught in his throat. His thoughts were clouded with a dizzying swirl of confusion, fear, and curiosity. His pulse raced as he fought to make sense of what was happening to him. He felt different, but he couldn't quite place how. Ilara's eyes fluttered shut for a moment, and Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He gently touched her cheek, feeling her cool skin beneath his fingers. She was growing weaker by the second. He needed to find a way to get her medical help, but they were deep in enemy territory, and there was no chance of making it to safety without being spotted. "I'm here," he whispered, his voice breaking the silence. "I'm not going anywhere. I'll figure this out, I promise." Her lips twitched slightly, the faintest of smiles forming before the glow in her eyes slowly returned, brighter this time. But she seemed to focus on something beyond him, beyond their immediate surrounding. "I didn't bring you here just to save me, Ethan," she said, her voice now much clearer, though the weariness still weighed heavily on her words. "You were chosen for a reason. The Draxians, they are not the only threat we face. There are others who will come for us. For you." "Who else?" Ethan asked, confusion deepening. "The Draxians have already attacked you. How many more can there be?" Lyra paused, as though gathering her strength before responding. "There are factions in the universe older than the Draxians, forces who seek to control what they don't understand. The power that courses through you, through us, is the key to their domination. But you're not the only one who can tap into it, Ethan. You're just the beginning." Ethan felt a chill run down his spine at her words. The mention of control, domination, and power struck him deeply, and his hands instinctively clenched into fists. This wasn't just some accident, some random meeting between a soldier and an alien. This was something bigger. He had been thrust into a galactic struggle, and the stakes were far higher than he could have imagined. A loud crack split the silence, followed by the whir of engines overhead. Ethan's heart skipped. The Draxan warship was descending, its massive silhouette blotting out the stars as it began to land nearby. "We have no time," Lyra said, her eyes wide with urgency. "We need to leave now. I can feel them. Draxian soldiers are on their way." Ethan looked around desperately. The wreckage was the only cover, but they couldn't hide for long. If the Draxians were already landing troops, their sensors would quickly pick up on any movement. He had to act, and fast. Lyra's hand trembled as she reached for him. "You must listen carefully, Ethan. There are places, hidden places, where my people left clues. They were hiding the truth, and the power you've awakened in you can lead you to it." He furrowed his brow, shaking his head in disbelief. "What are you talking about? Hidden places? What truth?" "The ancient archives," Lyra said, her voice softer now, almost like a whisper. "Before the Draxians betrayed us, we hid our greatest weapon, but they've been searching for it for centuries. The blood bond between us. It's a map. Your connection to me will guide you to the archive. There you will learn the truth of our people and the key to defeating them." Ethan's heart raced. "What do you mean, the key to defeating them? You said the Draxians aren't the only threat we face. What if this archive holds something worse than them?" Her expression grew more serious, her face filled with regret. "If the Draxians find the archive before you do, there may be no stopping them." The ground beneath them rumbled, and Ethan could hear the heavy footsteps of the Draxian soldiers growing closer. He helped Lyra to her feet, supporting her weight as they began to move toward the wreckage, their footsteps muffled by the shifting sands. "Do you think you can trust me, Ethan?" Lyra asked, her voice a mixture of exhaustion and urgency. Ethan glanced at her, his eyes narrowed, conflicted. She had been his salvation, yet she was asking him to place his life, his trust, in her hands completely. A part of him wanted to run, to leave everything behind and escape this nightmare, but he couldn't. Not when her life was so deeply entwined with his. "I don't know what to think anymore," he said honestly. "But I'm not going to let you die." She gave him a weak but sincere smile. "Then we will find the truth together." They made their way through the wreckage, carefully avoiding the areas where the Draxians were most likely setting up their search grid. Ethan kept his hand firmly on his weapon, ready for anything, but deep inside he felt the undeniable pull of the bond with Lyra, guiding him as if their very souls were linked in a way he couldn't understand. As they approached a narrow passage between two massive pieces of the wrecked ship, Lyra paused. "Here," she said, her voice urgent. This is the entrance. The path to the archive is hidden beneath the remains of the ship. The Draxians won't be able to follow us here, but we must hurry." Ethan felt a sense of unease settle in his stomach. They were entering unknown territory and the dangers were growing by the second. But the knowledge that Ilara's survival and the fate of the galaxy now rested on his shoulders made him feel more determined than ever. "I'm with you," he said. "Let's find it." With that, they stepped into the shadows, the door to the unknown opening before them. The Draxians, once confident in their superiority, now hesitated. They had never encountered anything like this before. Their leader, the warlord, struggled to push himself up from the ground, his body still smoldering from the blast that Ethan had unleashed. The energy from the attack had scorched the very air, and the dark sky now seemed to shimmer with the remnants of Ethan's power. For a moment, silence filled the barren landscape of Ilara 7, broken only by the wind sweeping across the wreckage. The Draxians regrouped, circling warily, their glowing red eyes fixated on Ethan and Ilara. It was clear they had never seen such force in a human before, and they were unsure of how to proceed. Ethan's chest heaved as he stood beside Ilara, the pulse of their bond throbbing like a living thing between them. The power he had felt surge through him moments ago was still there, raw, untamed, and yet strangely familiar. It was like something inside him had awakened, as though the deepest parts of his soul had been touched by something ancient, something alien. He didn't know if it was the blood bond, the energy Ilara had shared with him, or something else entirely, but it was undeniable. He had power now, more than he had ever imagined. More than any human had the right to possess. But with that power came a terrifying realization. This wasn't just a gift, it was a danger. "You must not let them strike first," Ilara said, her voice calm but filled with urgency. She was standing beside him, her eyes glowing brighter than before. The shimmering light from her skin now pulsed in rhythm with Ethan's heartbeat, creating a strange resonance between them. She looked less fragile now, more alive than she had moments ago. "Right," Ethan replied, his voice hoarse. The raw power still coursed through him, threatening to burst free, but he struggled to focus. "But I don't know how to control this. I've never done anything like that before." Taylor's gaze softened, her lips curling into a faint smile. "The power is not yours to control alone. It is a part of me now, a part of us. Together, we can master it." Ethan turned to face her fully, studying her face for any hint of deception, but all he saw was the truth. Her eyes were filled with a calm determination, the kind he had only seen in the faces of soldiers prepared for battle. She wasn't scared. And somehow that steadied him. "Then let's make sure we're ready," he said, his voice gaining strength. But even as he spoke, the Draxian warlord let out a low, guttural growl, rising from the rubble with surprising speed. His armor, once cracked and scorched, began to glow with a menacing red hue as his soldiers closed in behind him, weapons raised. Their tall, insectoid forms towered over Ethan and Ilara, their features twisted into sneers. "You have no idea what you've unleashed, human," the warlord spat. His voice was thick with venom. "The power you possess is nothing compared to the wrath of the Draxian Empire. Surrender now, and we may spare your pathetic life." Ethan's hands clenched into fists, the heat of the power still flowing through him. It was like an instinct now, this energy, something that responded to his thoughts and emotions. It wasn't just his body that had changed. It was his very perception of reality. The world around him seemed sharper, clearer, as if his senses were heightened beyond human limits. "Not a chance," Ethan said, his voice unwavering. He could feel the energy pulsing at his fingertips, ready to be unleashed. But there was something else, something unsettling, a warning in the back of his mind. The power, as incredible as it was, felt like it could consume him. He didn't know how long he could control it. The Draxian soldiers lunged forward in unison, their weapons crackling with deadly energy. They had no intention of negotiating. They were here to eradicate. Ethan didn't wait for them to make the first move. With a sudden, swift motion, he thrust his hand out. The power he had felt before surged through him, a torrent of energy that exploded from his palm in a brilliant burst of light. The ground beneath him cracked, and the air around him shimmered with the force of the attack. A blinding wave of light surged toward the Draxians, sending them sprawling backward. The shock wave was so intense that it rattled the very bones of the soldiers, and several were thrown clear into the rocky terrain. Their weapons discharged, but their aim was wild, scattering harmlessly into the dark sky. Ethan stood, his arm extended, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The energy around him was still swirling, a chaotic, untamed force that felt like it could tear apart the very fabric of reality. It was exhilarating, but terrifying. He could feel Alara's presence beside him, her energy flowing through him, guiding him, and yet there was a strange distance between them now, as though their bond had deepened in a way he couldn't fully understand. Her voice echoed in his mind, soft but insistent. "Control it, Ethan," she said. "Focus. Let it guide you, not consume you." But the Draxian warlord wasn't finished. Rising from the debris, he let out a vicious roar, his voice dripping with rage. The energy from Ethan's attack had not only stunned his soldiers, but it had also activated something in the warlord's armor, an ancient alien technology that seemed to hum with power. "You think you can defeat me?" the warlord sneered, his voice filled with fury. "You're nothing but a puppet, a vessel for forces you can't comprehend." Ethan's body trembled with the strain of the power flowing through him, but he couldn't stop. The bond between him and Lyra was now unbreakable, and though he feared the consequences, he knew one thing for certain: he could never turn back. With a sharp cry, the warlord's armor flared to life. A pulse of red energy shot from his chest, cutting through the air with a sound like thunder. The blast collided with the energy field Ethan had summoned, causing an explosion of force that sent both combatants reeling. Ethan staggered, his vision blurring as the shock wave reverberated through his body. The world around him seemed to pulse and warp, reality bending in strange ways. His connection with Lyra was still there, but it was like the bond was pulling at him, stretching him thin. He could feel her presence in his mind, a steady anchor, but also something more, a deeper power, a hidden strength he hadn't fully grasped yet. "Focus, Ethan," Lyra's voice whispered through the haze. "This is our fight, together." She was right. He couldn't afford to lose control now, not when they were so close to victory. He took a deep breath, focusing on the bond they shared, on the energy flowing between them. The Draxian warlord had underestimated them both, and Ethan wasn't going to let that happen again. With a fierce yell, Ethan pushed forward. The energy surged from him once more, this time more controlled, more precise. The warlord staggered, but he was not easily defeated. He raised his weapon ready to strike again. But before the warlord could fire, a sudden blinding flash of light erupted from Lyra. The alien woman who had been silent in the chaos stood tall, her form glowing with the same radiant energy that had filled Ethan moments before. The light around her swirled like a storm, enveloping her in an ethereal cocoon of power. The warlord froze, his red eyes wide in disbelief. Lyra was no longer the fragile, injured being Ethan had found in the wreckage. She had become something else, something powerful, something beyond human understanding. "Together," Lyra whispered, her voice resonating through the air like a symphony. The Draxian warlord raised his weapon, but before he could fire, Lyra's energy exploded outward, engulfing him in a massive shock wave. The sheer force of the blast shattered the warlord's armor, sending him flying back with a scream that echoed across the wasteland. The Draxian soldiers scattered, but they were no match for the combined might of Ethan and Lyra. The remaining soldiers were soon dispatched, their weapons torn from their hands, their bodies thrown to the ground in disarray. As the dust settled, Ethan stood, breathing heavily, his body still trembling with the aftershocks of the battle. He looked over at Lyra, who was now standing beside him, her form glowing with a soft, radiant light. The bond between them was stronger than ever, and he could feel her presence in his mind, a calming force that eased the chaos within him. "We did it," Ethan said, his voice filled with awe. Lyra nodded, her expression serene. "We are bound now, Ethan, and together we will shape the future. But remember, this is only the beginning."